the R.M.Williams OUTBACK podcast, bringing to life the characters that feature in OUTBACK magazine and more.
Hello, this is Terry Carley welcoming you back to the OUTBACK podcast. Today's episode with writer Annabelle Brayley is pretty wide-ranging. It starts with Annabelle approaching OUTBACK about 20 years ago with an idea for a story in OUTBACK Queensland, and ends with her continuing to champion Australia's long-forgotten nurses in the Vietnam War. We're glad to have played a small part in this important story. Enjoy Annabelle Brayley and her journey from nurse to nurses champion. In the small southwestern Queensland town of Morven sits the only memorial to the Australian nurses in the Vietnam War. The location is no accident. It's the town Annabelle Brayley lives in. Originally a nurse herself, Annabelle left healthcare to pursue her love of storytelling, first in the pages of OUTBACK magazine and then in books, 5 in fact, one of which is all about nurses in that terrible conflict involving Australians for a decade until 1972. Annabelle is now leading a push to expand the Nurses Memorial as a further tribute to those women whose service was not recognised for so long. Hello, Annabelle.
Hello, Terry.
It's been a long and winding road that's led you from nursing yourself to advocating for the Vietnam nurses. Can you tell me where it started?
So for starters, Terry, I did train as a nurse, but I really should have been a hairdresser. And I keep telling people that. And I think they think, I should have been just a hairdresser. But I actually really did want to be a hairdresser. And I think that hairdressers are the world's original counsellors. People talk to hairdressers. You go to them, you generally get a cup of coffee or something and offload all your worries and whatever and come out looking absolutely fabulous. So what's not to love about hairdressers? But my father, I grew up in a small community halfway to Brisbane from here with 4 brothers. And my father said, if you're going to go further west, you have to be either a nurse or a teacher so that you can, you'll be able to work, which would have been fine if I'd actually lived anywhere near town. But I finished my nursing training in Charleville, and then when I got married, I went and lived 130 kilometres from town. And so nursing was actually not viable 45 years ago. Whereas if I'd been a hairdresser, I used to go to the local Kneebine Community Centre on the weekends, and we would, have tennis or whatever social activities over there once a month, and I would cut hair. And I've always maintained if I trained as a hairdresser, I could have charged $10 instead of $2. So for a whole lot of reasons, I really should have been a hairdresser. However...
Yeah, but if you had been, we wouldn't be talking today probably, would we?
Well, and that's the sliding door thing.
Yeah.
If I hadn't been a nurse, that certainly played into what eventually happened. It didn't so much when I started being published as a writer, but it certainly did when I came to be writing about nurses, yeah.
So I did give ourselves a shout out in the intro as being a little bit instrumental in starting you off on your writing career. Can you expand on that for me?
Absolutely. And I've made no secret of this over the years. So I have said I never planned to be a writer, never meant to be a writer. That's actually not entirely correct. I mean, I think we're all storytellers on some level, and I think I've always been a writer. I've always been a writer. I used to write long letters at school, etc. I think the thing I never planned for, because I never imagined it happening, was actually being published as a writer. And so it's one of those, pie in the sky kind of dreams, like winning lotto, someone's, especially living where I lived. But we sold out in 2001 and moved up to the Morven community. We didn't ever plan to stay here, but it's such a great community, we did. And I'd been working in a remote health care service and decided that I needed to get out of it because I was driving, just doing a lot of driving, and I fell asleep one day and thought, that's it. So in my wisdom, I decided to buy the Morven News Agency. I'd already been reading OUTBACK long since, but buying the news agency actually gave me an insight into the magazine industry from a completely different perspective. I had no idea, how I still don't really understand it, but I didn't even think about it before that. So he was Outback sitting on my shop, or about to be in my shop. I hadn't quite taken over. Again, sliding door thing. The Victoria Downs Merino Stud were celebrating their centenary in April 2006. And I had just signed the contract to buy the newsagent. And I wrote to and I think Paul Myers was the editor-in-chief then. Anyway, I wrote to the editor-in-chief of Outback and said, are you sending somebody up here to write, about the Victoria Downs centenary? Because it's obviously very important. So long story short, I think this is the way I tell the story. I'm not sure, exactly because it's 20 years ago, but I believe that he wrote to me and said, can you write? And I wrote back, this is the short version of the email, and said no. Oh, well, actually, yes, but I've never been published. And I had written some book reviews for Pedals magazine over the years. And so that was what I sent as my, this is my sample of writing. Anyway, they weren't going to get anyone else here to write this story. So I wrote that first story. They sent a photographer out. And I can remember now, even now, just the sheer excitement of him writing back and saying, yes, we're going to commission the story. It coming out in the magazine, those first glossy pages, all of that was just so exciting. And I think I did send you a copy. I actually photocopied the first check I received from Outback because this was like a lotto thing.
How much was it for? Do you remember?
I believe it was for $1,400.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
That's
I know.
Not bad. I don't think our payments have gone up.
For me, it was that sheer excitement. It's just this idea of actually being published. It's like, wow.
That validation.
Anyway, so then I've got the bug. So I was pitching a few more stories and so forth. And some of those stories that I wrote actually included one about Peter Moody conquering Caulfield, I think it was called. This was back in his early days.
I remember.
Another story about the Condamine Cods Rugby Club and Lee McNichol. It was a really special story about depression and so forth. And then in 2011, Mark actually contacted me and asked me would I write a cover story about rural and remote health.
Just filling in who Mark is for listeners. So if they don't know, Mark Muller is the editor-in-chief.
And I actually didn't know what a cover story was, to be honest. I don't know a whole lot of things about writing because, this is not what I planned to do. It felt like a big story, a big responsibility. I just honestly nearly said, no, I don't know how to do that, can't do that. But I don't believe in doing that. I actually think we should all embrace opportunities because you never know where they will lead. And I'm the perfect story about that. So I actually said yes. That came out in January 2012. And I came home from town one day just after the magazine came out. And there was a message on my answering machine saying, my name is whoever. I'm an editor at Penguin Books Australia. And we're wondering whether you'd be interested in a project that we're doing about nurses. And initially I actually thought, this is someone having a go at me. But it was a Melbourne phone number. So I rang back and sure enough, it actually was a publisher at Penguin Australia, Andrew McNamara, who asked me would I be interested in collating stories about bush nurses. I'm just as astonished when I look back at some of those opportunities that have come. I said yes, of course. I wrote some of the stories, but most of them I just edited and collated for that first book, Bush Nurses, the proceeds of which went to Frontier Services. And out of that, I met some nurses. And I think this is where the nursing thing was helpful for me because I could contact nurses and say, yes, I am a nurse. I didn't have to say I was a bloody awful nurse or I should never have been a nurse, just I am a nurse. I get what you're talking about. And so I met some amazing nurses through that project and then pitched them to Penguin and said, I think really there are some amazing stories here that could be a book in it. And so I wrote Nurses of the Outback and then a couple more books after. But while I was writing Nurses of the Outback, somebody in the Northern Territory asked me, did I know any nurses who went to Vietnam? And, as I said to you before, I look back now and I think if I hadn't asked about the Victoria Downs story, if Mark hadn't said, can you write? Or Paul, I guess initially, if I'd said no to the cover story, I mean, none of my career would have happened. But none of this would have happened either. None of this recognition of the Vietnam nurses would have happened in the way it's happened.
So someone at that point said, do you know about the Vietnam nurses? Did you know about them?
I absolutely didn't have a clue. And what's more, at the time, I'm ashamed to say I didn't think about it again until much later that year, because I was on a project talking to remote area nurses. And after I came home, I was listening one day to something about long tan. The question popped back in my head. And I thought, I suppose there must have been nurses over there because, we had wounded Australians, must have been nurses looking after them at some point. And so I started a Google search. One of the first people I found was Jan McCarthy, who's retired colonel of the Royal Australian Army Nursing Corps. And she was in Vietnam for 12 months. When she came home, because she was a career nurse, she stayed in the Army. She actually eventually became the matron-in-chief of the Royal Australian Army Nursing Corps. And she was instrumental in changing a number of things that are beneficial to combat nurses now. One of those was training nurses to carry weapons and use them so that they could protect themselves and their patients wherever they were. There are a number of other things, but that was one of the really significant things. And Jan was also able to then tell me the names of some other Army nurses who were still alive. And she certainly would have told me about the existence of the RAAF nurses and the civilian nurses. I had to go searching for them because the RAAF nurses actually weren't acknowledged for their service until 1994, and they had to fight for it. And the civilian nurses weren't acknowledged for their service until 2020, not in any way that matters.
Yeah, I guess the whole Vietnam thing, there's the double whammy there, isn't there, where nobody wanted to sort of recognise anybody, and then you've got the whole sexist thing on top of that, where women were even less likely to be recognised than men.
Yeah. And not just not recognised, but actively told, particularly again with the RAAF nurses. So there were about 104 RAAF nurses who were based at Butterworth, who flew at least one medevac into Vietnam and out, and flew soldiers, because they'd fly into Vietnam, bring them back to Butterworth to the number 4 hospital and stabilise them again, and then fly them back to Australia if they had to come back, or fly them back to Vietnam if they were well enough.
Butterworth was Malaysia?
Malaysia, yeah. But a number of them did more than one flight. A number of them did a lot of flights and repatriations home. But 32 of them were actually deployed to USAF by the Australian government. They did 60-day rotations with USAF, which is the United States Air Force. They were based at Clark Airfield in the Philippines, and they used to fly daily milk runs down through Vietnam, picking up wounded Americans and Koreans and flying them back to either Clark or Japan. There were so many stories they told about terrible aeroplanes. They're often in danger. They were shot at, a whole lot of things. They got back to Australia and Defence said, oh, well, you weren't really there, because they weren't actually based in Vietnam. One of the nurses, Margaret Kagenvan, Margaret Sutherland is her name now, and she was just very recently awarded a very high American award as acknowledgement for her service with USAF. She's the only Australian RAAF nurse that has been awarded that. Margaret wrote to her mother every day from Butterworth or Clark. And so in the early 1990s, when they were trying to access, DVA, gold cards, just, we were there, acknowledge us, she was able to use that information. And she and another nurse called Gaynor Tilley actually wrote a submission to a review into overseas service, and they were successful. And so in 1994, they were actually awarded access to gold cards and service medals, and were told, you were really there, and you really did, you did this amazing thing. Some of them up until then had felt, they'd been told they couldn't wear their uniforms when they came back to go to work. If they were living off base and driving to work, they weren't allowed to wear the uniforms, ostensibly because, everybody's upset about Vietnam and it's for your own safety. But I think for many of them, they felt like, we've been told we weren't really there, and now we've been told we can't wear our uniforms. And this is in addition to the fact that when they got married, they had to leave the services anyway, any of the military nurses, because they're mere women, and once they're married, all of a sudden they're not capable of delivering the same service. I think most of them felt actively rejected rather than just ignored.
Not to mention, the trauma that some of them would have had and wouldn't have been addressed either.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. I don't doubt that many of them suffered PTSD. All of the veterans. I've not been in the military. I've not served anywhere overseas. I've not served anywhere in any in that kind of context. But I've talked to a lot of veterans over the last 13 years, and I can't help feeling that one of the reasons, in addition to the traumatic things that they might see, do, experience, one of the really significant reasons that veterans suffer from PTSD is because we train them to go, but we don't train them to come home. And we don't help them to transition home. The military still doesn't support veterans well to come home, I don't believe.
So just to summarise, because this is a bit of an education piece probably for a lot of people, and it certainly was for me, and you said you didn't know very much when it first came to your attention. So tell me if any of these figures are wrong from your research, Annabelle, but the Vietnam Nurses Memorial at Morven, it's finally come to be more than half a century after the end of the Vietnam War. 52,000 Australian men served. 353 Australian women nursed from 1964 to 1972. As you said, RAAF, Army and civilian surgery team nurses. And the exhibition you have at the Morven Historical Society has images from the Australian War Memorial, from the nurses, and some donated by the family of well-known war photographer Dennis Stanley Gibbons, and it is the first memorial to our Vietnam nurses.
Yeah, it's the only memorial, I believe, in Australia that's dedicated solely to these Australian women. They are mentioned in other places, particularly the military nurses are mentioned in the Australian War Memorial. The Army nurses and the civilian nurses are mentioned at Heidelberg Hospital. There are other places around the country, Vietnam Veterans Museum on Phillip Island, obviously, but this is the only one that actually acknowledges the service of all of them, civilian and military.
When was the opening of the Vietnam Nurses Memorial?
The memorial actually came about because about 2.5 years ago, the Morven Historical Museum, which is, a typical country museum, it embraces local stories, etc., etc., etc. There was a room that suddenly became available because an exhibition was removed, and another sliding door moment. I just happened to hear about it at the right time. And straight away, honestly, as soon as I heard the room was available, I could see this exhibition in my head. Just because maybe it was lurking there, who knows, but I just thought, how amazing would it be if we could actually do this? So I approached the Morven Historical Museum, of which I'd not been a member, but as it happens, the president is a Vietnam veteran. So that was obviously incredibly helpful. And I pitched the idea to them of actually creating a memorial room and using these photographs, et cetera, et cetera. So we did that, and we opened it, and we were able to do that with a little help from the Regional Arts Development Fund in Queensland. There's a history section, so we were able to apply for some funding to get the photographs redeveloped. There's a wonderful, he's just sold his business actually, a wonderful guy in Toowoomba called Kerwin Ross, who developed all of these photographs to the size that we have them for the memorial. We purchased, as you said, some of the images from the War Memorial. I had access to a couple privately, and then Sean Gibbons, who's Dennis Stanley Gibbons' son, donated us the use of his father's photographs, which he had also done for the book. And Kerwin developed them, and they just are the most beautiful images. Some of them are incredibly graphic, but they are beautifully developed images, and then they were framed in Toowoomba.
I believe 4 Vietnam nurses came to the opening. That must have been so emotional for them.
I think it was quite emotional for them. They were 2 Army nurses, an RAAF nurse and a civilian nurse who came to that first opening. We opened the memorial on the 24th of April, 2024, and we purposely did it on the afternoon before Anzac Day because Anzac Day is obviously about Anzacs. I think, as Janet Glasson said at the time, and Janet was in the civilian surgical teams, she actually came from the Thargomindah district. Her parents lived between Western Queensland and Western New South Wales. And when she came back from Vietnam, her brother drew a place, rural block at Thargomindah, and she went back to that area. She actually nursed at the Cunnamulla Hospital for a while, got married and ended up as the matron of the Cunnamulla Hospital. And I think one of the things about that story is that I've no doubt that there were people in the district who knew that she'd been in Vietnam, but I just don't think most of them would have thought what that really meant. I mean, they actually had a matron in that hospital who could deal with pretty much anything that came through the door. Because in Vietnam, they all had this extraordinary experience where they were dealing with particularly the civilian nurses in provincial hospitals, but even in the military hospitals, a lot of the time they didn't have the resources that they should have had. The Americans backed up both lots, the military hospital and certainly the civilian teams that were working in provincial hospitals. They begged, borrowed and stole, literally, resources that they needed to help, this is the surgical teams, to help local South Vietnamese people. That's who they were essentially looking after. And they were working in circumstances where, hospitals with 400 beds and 600 patients, and then all the relatives and the kids, etc. And hospitals where the power was intermittent at best, water was intermittent at best. It was pretty grim. So, and they dealt with some horrific injuries, but also some horrific illnesses in the civilian hospitals. So the civilian nurses like Janet brought that, all of them brought back their experience to Australia and applied it in varying ways that I don't think anybody appreciated at the time. For many of them, it was an opportunity for adventure, to travel, but certainly to contribute, to do their duty as they were asked. And I do wonder now if we ordinary Australians were asked to step up. I hope we would. I like to think that most of us would. But we've lived such cushy lives for the last, 5 decades, really, in so many ways. And a lot of that is thanks to World War I and World War II veterans and to the likes of the Vietnam veterans.
I was looking back at some of the news stories that were done at the opening of your memorial, and I think you were quoted as saying most of them will still tell you they don't know what Australia was doing over there in the first place.
I think that's true, Terry. Look, I'm old enough to remember Vietnam. My eldest brother was called up. So by the time he might have actually gone to Vietnam, Gough Whitlam was actually pulling people out. So I'm old enough, as I said, to have that sort of awareness. And then my husband and my next brother were both in the call-up. They missed out. At the time, I left school in 1972, so Vietnam was just ending. And I guess we all just got back to being busy with and I was in all-girls boarding school. We probably didn't know much about it anyway, really, but, not as much as everybody else. Vietnam is the first war that we watched on our 6 o'clock news. One of the nurses told me that her parents found out that she was in Vietnam when they saw her loading a patient in Vung Tau on the 6 o'clock news. Even then, we were incredibly influenced by what we saw on the TV. I mean, this new magic, box in the living room.
So you're at stage 2 of the memorial now, and you want to put a monument out the front. Tell me about what's it a monument of, and how's that going to work?
If I could just go to stage 2, which is honour boards, and the reason I'd like to mention that is because of the numbers of nurses. I always believe that there are about 350. There are certainly about 350 women who went to Vietnam, but some of them were doctors, radiologists in both military and non-military. And so the actual nurses, I know that there are a bit over 300 actual nurses who went, but the civilian nurses are a little harder to clarify. I've been trying to verify in the last few years exactly who was a nurse and who wasn't on those lists. And it's very hard to get hold of any constructed lists. So the honour boards which we have, I know that the RAAF and the Royal Australian Army Nursing Corps nurses and names are correct. But if there's anyone who hears this podcast who either knows of a civilian nurse who went to Vietnam or would like to check whether their name is on the board, I'd be really happy to hear from them because it is extremely hard to verify. We would like to. And I have already found one nurse who contacted me recently and said, I was a bit disappointed to find my names are not on the board. That is because my research actually said that she was a radiologist. Yeah, so I'd really like to correct any of those names if we can. So to go to the next stage then, there's a very beautiful monument in America. So the Americans didn't acknowledge their nurses straight away either, but they did long before Australia did. And what's more, the Americans actually acknowledged the RAAF nurses well before Australia did. Some of those 32, and probably all of 32, who were deployed to USAF were invited to Arlington for the opening of the Nurses Memorial there, and a handful of them went. So they were acknowledged. And when I was doing the research, etc., I just saw this monument of the nurses. Now, they're very obviously, it's a military-based monument, but I got it into my head that imagine if we could create something here that tells the story of all of these nurses. You know, this whole memorial is not just an acknowledgement. We've had enough Vietnam veterans through here now to know that this is a place of, I would say, serenity. It's very poignant walking around. Even now, and I'm pretty familiar, even now I can stand in some of those photographs and feel very moved by the experience of being in there and seeing what they do. So I think it would be wonderful for future generations to have this monument. The drawings have been put together by an artist in Perth called Lee Crichton, who is she's related by marriage to the sculptor that we are commissioning to create the 5 life-size bronze sculptures, Mella Cook. She's based in Brisbane, and it will be forged at a foundry in Brisbane. Because one of the other things about this was, I've had a couple of people said to me, "Oh, look, why don't you go to China? You could get statues made in China for a quarter of the price." I'm like, oh, actually don't care. That would be like a slap in the face, in my opinion. These people are all fiercely patriotic to Australia. And we need to be fiercely patriotic about how we acknowledge them and respect their feelings about that. So the idea of having it made in Australia, first and foremost, was paramount. And then when I went searching for a sculptor, I kind of fell across Mella, who creates these really clean, elegant, beautiful figures.
What are they made out of?
They're bronze. I didn't ever want this to be very formal, military, traditional kind of statues, because the nurses who went to Vietnam went in nylon traditional uniforms with nylon stockings and black shoes and handbags and veils and whatever else they had to wear, because that's what they wore. But it was a hot tropical climate, and that just didn't suit. So, a lot of the photographs, they're in scrubs, wearing as little clothing as possible in the circumstances. So mostly scrubs and less formal uniforms. So these sculptures will reflect that. And Mella's beautiful, clean lines lend themselves to that overall look of just elegant, beautiful women doing their job.
And you're hoping that you can get some more donations to see that through. And it was really nice that in the last issue of Outback, we had I think it was a letter from you about the memorial and how you were continuing to fundraise. And we've had a couple of our readers, as people can read in the next issue of Outback, or one in particular, who have come to the party, which is really nice.
Which was just wonderful. It's a really lovely story, because the nurses in general have enhanced my life in ways I could not have imagined when that particular sliding door slid. And one of the joys that I've experienced out of this has been reconnecting some people who haven't seen each other either since Vietnam or since just after they got home. But it's also hearing the stories and being able to envisage exactly what they were talking about. So yes, one of your readers in particular did donate, and I've had a number of conversations with him, and there's a lovely story about this as well, the country town thing. Ray Waters is a veteran. He was a career army, was in Borneo, Malaysia before he went to Vietnam in late 60s. And he actually read what I had written in your magazine and contacted me saying, he wasn't actually wounded himself, but he said, I know what the nurses did. And also his aunt worked with Vivian Bullwinkle. And so for him, this was kind of like in memory of them, a way to remember them, which is really, really lovely. But the other beautiful part about that story was that a girl at the bank in Corrion, where he lives, I actually contacted her because Ray is in his 80s and doesn't hear so well. So I contacted her to let her know that this donation was going to be happening. It's really just amazing and wonderful when people donate, but I'm also very conscious of, transparency because I could be any random person. So I contacted her. The whole thing went through. That was all lovely. But then I needed to get in contact with Ray again about something else. And he doesn't answer the phone because he can't hear it. So I rang the girl at the bank and I said, next time you see Ray, would you mind asking him to ring me? Which he did. And I just think that's that lovely small country town thing where people actually still do help each other and get involved in that story. And I think people are attracted by all the good stuff in these stories. Not just that one, but just in general. I think people are essentially good. And this whole project, as I said to you before, in the district here, I think that, I'm safe to say that most people in the district are pretty proud about the memorial that it's here. So if I can raise this money fast enough, I need to raise it in the next 2 or 3 months or have commitments of it in the next 2 or 3 months to ensure we open it next year in April, because it'll take 5 or 6 months for Mella to create and then the foundry to forge the bronze sculptures, and then we've got to get them out here and installed, etc. But I'd like to do it for next year if it's possible, because they're entering their 80s now. There's not a lot of them are still alive in relation to the number who went. And I think if we're going to the trouble to do something like this, it's really lovely if they can be here to see it and to enjoy it and to enjoy the attention that's, given them. They've had such a lovely experience, some of them just coming out here into a quite rural community. It's been an opportunity for them to experience country hospitality and that small country Anzac Day thing, which is quite different to the big city commemorations. Yeah. So it's a lot of money.
So if anyone's listening to this and they want to contribute, how do they do that?
If they could get in touch with me at vietnamnursesmemorial@gmail.com. It's not just for Vietnam veterans. This is for people who love a good story, are interested in seeing any veterans acknowledged. They may well be Vietnam veterans who have reason to be thankful, or their families have reason to be thankful to the nurses. Or they just could be people out there who understand that this is a one-off legacy project. Future generations will have a greater understanding of our Australian history if they can come to places like this and actually learn these stories.
What you need to do to really get the word out there is you need to write a book called The Australian Women, because as we were talking earlier, Annabelle, I asked you if you had read Kristen Hanna's The Women, which has been a literary sensation over the past year or two, which is a fictional account, though hopefully based in a lot of fact, of all the American nurses in Vietnam. You told me you had read it and enjoyed it. You just need to write The Australian, The Women.
Yeah, well, actually.
Easy.
That's the funny thing. I said to Andrea one day, Andrea McNamara, who was my publisher at Penguin, this would be a whole lot easier if I could just make it up. Anyway, she laughed. And of course, now I realise that it's actually a whole lot easier if you can just research it and write the story. It's a whole lot harder if you've got to make it up. In some ways, that's my experience. But then I'm used to writing nonfiction, but I would actually love to write a novel about Vietnam. I've been talking about it for about probably 8 years. I have to say that when Kristen Hanna's book came out, I thought, oh, well, there you go. That's completely blown my project out of the water, which was just one more excuse not to do it, really.
No, ride the wave.
There is that.
And, it's always that Australian experience that's unique and is very different to the American experience, that's for sure.
That's actually very true. And also the civilian nurses and RAAF nurses. I mean, they also had civilian nurses and RAAF nurses there as well, but it is a different story. Yeah.
The success of the women would probably give people a bit of a frame of reference and might actually help you. But anyway, I'm sure you've got plenty of other things to do.
Well, first and foremost, get this memorial, this monument actually funded.
Well, you never know. Some of our listeners may be able to help. Look at what you've achieved already. I have no doubt you'll get there, Annabelle.
I believe that we will, yeah.
Well, you've got to believe it to do it, don't you? So,
and you've got to say yes.
Yes.
Always.
That's the lesson from this podcast, folks. Always say yes. Well, we'll leave it there, but I'm sure this is far from the last we've heard of the Vietnam Nurses Memorial And you, Annabelle.
Thank you so much for your interest. And I would say also, seriously, thanks to Outback for saying yes when I pitched a story, etc. Because it is true that none of this would have happened if I hadn't written for Outback in the first place.
Well, yeah, we're just going to claim credit for the whole lot.
No, Terry, thanks. And seriously, thanks to Outback. I mean, a lot of it's on me saying yes, but a lot of it's on the magazine supporting writers like me who live in remote areas as well.
Well, exactly. Like, this is Outback's whole mission, is to support rural and regional Australia. And the main way we do that, obviously, is to tell stories, but it's also to use local people where we can.
You know, it's life-changing for more than just me, because I do know of other writers that write for you. They're doing that because they've been supported by the magazine, regardless of where they live. Probably a number of them are actually trained writers who, knew what a cover story was when they started. But there's always been that potential for people like me who knew none of that, but who can and do want to tell stories.
And you have the authentic local voice.
That is also very true. And I think it's to be acknowledged that Outback does appreciate that. I think that what Outback has done has actually enabled and authenticated rural and remote storytellers in a way that other magazines or publications don't, because it's too easy for them to just get someone on the phone, do a bit in an interview, write a story, and not really care whether the facts are right or not, whether they've interpreted it correctly. That's a huge thing. One of the things I first learned was what people say is not necessarily what they mean. So having that time to clarify detail and to check that that's exactly what they meant is really important.
And just to understand issues because you're on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. The language has to be authentic.
Thank you for being on the podcast, and it's been really interesting to hear all about the great work you're doing to recognise the Vietnam nurses, and we'll certainly keep our readers updated on what is happening in that space, Annabelle.
Thanks, Terry. I really appreciate that. It's been terrific talking to you, and it's been terrific being part of the Outback stable for all these years.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of the R.M.Williams Outback podcast. Some of the work at the Vietnam Nurses Memorial in Morven, Queensland, has been documented in the feedback section of several recent issues of Outback magazine. You can find out more about the VNM on the Facebook page of the Morven Historical Society, or, as Annabelle said in the podcast, email vietnamnursesmemorial@gmail.com. For more on getting a copy of Outback, or for subscription offers that include free postage to your door, go to outbackmag.com.au. This podcast is hosted and produced by me, Terry Cowley. Editor-in-Chief is Mark Muller. Original theme music by Isaac May.